summer of 1940, Adolf Hitler planned to invade Britain. But Germany's air force, the mighty Luftwaffe, found itself outclassed by the fighter pilots of Britain's Royal Air Force in an air battle that would change the course of World War II. The British pilots owed their success to two modern fighter aircraft, the Hurricane and an aircraft that has become a legend of the skies, perhaps the most famous aircraft design ever built, the immortal Spitfire.
It was a dream. You didn't fly it, you were part of it. And yet it could be a lethal weapon.
When I first went into combat, it was a steep learning curve. I was very frightened.
You had to look behind you about 45 seconds out of every minute if you were going to live. The important thing is to see the other person before they see you.
Using archive film and color reconstruction, Battle Stations enters the lonely and dangerous world of the fighter pilot on a Spitfire squadron. The warplane was born at the start of World War I, when fragile British and German spotter aircraft first ventured above the trenches of the Western Front. They were made of wood, wire, and canvas. By the end of the war in 1918, air battles involving bombers and fighters had become an established part of modern warfare. But by the 1930s, very little had changed. The aircraft were still biplanes. They were still made of wood and covered with fabric, and they were slow. Then, in 1931, a British seaplane reached the astonishing speed of 407 miles per hour, more than twice as fast as the biplanes then in service with most air forces. The S-6B was a streamlined metal monoplane far ahead of its time. It was the latest in a series of race winners created by the Supermarine Aircraft Company. Their chief designer, Reginald Mitchell, was a brilliant engineer who saw that traditional biplanes had had their day. In 1930, the British government had issued an official request to the aircraft industry to submit designs for a new fighter. Mitchell produced an aircraft which stuck closely to the government's brief, but proved to be little better than the biplanes it was meant to replace. He went back to the drawing board. Then, in 1933, a new sense of urgency focused his mind. The Nazi Party was voted into power in Germany. Its leader, Adolf Hitler, quickly set about rearming his country with a new generation of modern, all-metal bombers and fighters. Mitchell became seriously unwell. Cancer was diagnosed and he underwent a major operation. While convalescing in Europe, he talked with German pilots, enthusiastic about the new aircraft designs and itching for combat. He returned home to England, convinced that war was coming, and fired with a new determination to match the best that Germany could produce. Meanwhile, Britain's Rolls-Royce company was privately developing a new aircraft engine. It was powerful and more sophisticated than anything yet seen. It was christened the Merlin. Mitchell realized that this engine could give him the extra power he needed to create a high-speed fighter. In 1933, he began rough sketches for a new design, based on his own ideas, not the official specification. It had a streamlined fuselage, enclosed cockpit, and thin-section wings containing folding wheels and 8 machine guns. Mitchell's health was failing rapidly, and he was in constant pain. But by January 1935, work started on the prototype. In In a moment of pure inspiration, Mitchell created the gracefully curved wing shape, which was to become the hallmark of the Spitfire. Where biplanes had used a web of wires to brace a wooden frame, Mitchell's machine used a stressed metal skin riveted to metal formers. The wings were built up around a laminated spar, its many layers combining great strength with flexibility. It was a complex and brilliant design, but it would prove a nightmare to mass produce.
I think sometimes men with bright minds have flares of genius, and I think this was a flare. I think he must have been mulling over in his mind how you can get away from the old biplane and still retain the stress factors for diving, the thrust of guns, the thrust of power and everything else. Where are you going to put this? Are you going to put it in the wings? Are you going to put it in the fuselage? How are you going to do this? It was a very advanced form of construction in those days, but you see, R.J. Mitchell was an exceptional man. I can't think of anyone else that approached him.
By the spring of 1936, the prototype airframe and the new Rolls-Royce Merlin engine were ready. The two were fitted together, and on March the 6th, the very first Spitfire, number K5054, took to the air. It was a strikingly beautiful and revolutionary machine, which looked more like a racer than a fighter. After its initial flights, the prototype was passed to Supermarine test pilot Jeffrey Quill.
The cockpit was narrow, but not cramped. The instrument panel was tidy, symmetric, and logically laid out. At once, I felt good in that cockpit. I primed the Merlin engine carefully, and it started first time. I did my cockpit checks. With a last look round for other aircraft, I turned into wind and opened the throttle. Soon we were airborne and climbing away. Once fully airborne, the aircraft began to slip along as if on skates, with an immediate impression of effortless performance. Here, I thought to myself, is a real lady.
The lady was fast, and she certainly had looks. But was she a fighter? The revolutionary Spitfire was not the only contestant in the race to build a new RAF fighter. The Hawker Hurricane was a much less advanced design than the Spitfire, with a thick-section wing and a wire-braced fuselage with fabric covering. But it was easier to build. It was several months ahead in development, and with a top speed of about 330 miles per hour, it went almost as fast as the Spitfire. Mitchell knew that he could and must do better. But his health was failing fast, and his fighter had not yet been accepted by the Royal Air Force. He drove himself even harder.
To have a machine that in your heart you knew was a winner, and you knew that if war came, the whole nation would depend upon that machine. I mean, it's one of those things that rarely happens to anyone. And for someone to be aware of that, and he must have been aware of it for quite a period before his death, the mind boggles to think what a person is going through.
Meanwhile, in Germany, the Luftwaffe, commanded by Hermann Goering, was growing bigger and stronger every day. By 1936, the German threat was obvious, even to Britain's Air Ministry, and on June the 3rd, an order was placed for 600 Hurricanes, but only 310 Spitfires. Many still saw Mitchell's creation as a lightweight racing machine, fast, elegant, but not a fighter. As the exhausting program of testing ground on, Mitchell finally lost his long fight against cancer. His death on June the 11th, 1937, was a devastating blow to the Spitfire team. But the genius of his design had inspired them all, and his deputy, Joe Smith, was able to keep the Spitfire dream alive, although the work was soon a full year behind schedule. As the Air Ministry became increasingly frustrated and irritated by the delays, there was talk of abandoning the Spitfire program altogether. Alex Henshaw was chief test pilot at Supermarine's new factory at Castle Bromwich.
It was so advanced and so expensive that certainly in 1939, both Geoffrey Quill and myself said, oh no, it's a marvellous aircraft, but of course it'll never go into production. It's too difficult, too expensive. We had a contract for 300, and he said, Alex, you know, he said, I reckon this will be the end of the Spitfire.
As the German threat increased, Britain's production of fighters was stepped up, but time was rapidly running out.
And of course the dreadful thing to people like myself was the knowledge that I had and a lot of other people had that had travelled Germany, that they're a very, very efficient fighting machine, and that we were twiddling our thumbs, wasting time, and by God did we waste those months.
In 1938, Britain and France had come very close to war with Germany over German demands on Czechoslovakia. But in the case of Britain, defence was really in an appalling state. Although aircraft production was being stepped up, it was still a trickle. Without this invaluable year, the RAF would probably have gone to war with biplanes.
On the 4th of August 1938, the first operational Spitfire was finally delivered to an RAF station. 19 Squadron, based at Duxford, north of London, became the first fighter unit to exchange its biplanes for the new Spitfires. But the arms race was now on. Germany's Luftwaffe was already re-equipping with its answer to the Spitfire, the Messerschmitt Me-109. In 1939, Alex Henshaw was invited to Germany to view the new fighters.
The Germans were very conscious of their military power, and I think also very conscious that we're not a very competent lot anyway. In fact, when Major Sideman showed me the 109s, I said, well, we have the Spitfire. Oh, yes, he said, very pretty little toy, but the 109 is a fighting machine.
On the 3rd of September 1939, war was declared. Now Britain would have to face the full might of Germany's Luftwaffe. Young, eager pilots were rushed through their basic training. Most ended up flying Hurricanes, but the fortunate few found themselves posted to a Spitfire squadron.
One day, a Spitfire landed on the airfield, taxied over to our hangar. We all rushed over to this thing, walked around it, stroked it, sat in it. I know I fell a bit in love with this airplane. It was beautiful.
Like if you see a ship that looks as if it should sail, the Spitfire looked as if it should fly. The Spitfire as an aircraft was a thoroughbred.
I think that with any airplane, if it looks right, it will fly right. And let's face it, the Spitfire is the most beautiful airplanes ever been made. The first time we flew it, you got into it, and it started up. Oh, it was fantastic.
You were so excited and so young, which was probably very relevant, that it was just a thrilling experience with lots of frights. You scared yourself many, many times because it reacted so differently from the old biplanes. You didn't get into the aircraft and strap yourself in. You strapped the aircraft to you. you became part of the aircraft.
My shoulders touched both sides of the cockpit, and my head was about a quarter inch from the roof at the top. So you were part of the aeroplane. That was the beauty of the thing. I think if Mitchell hadn't designed the Spitfire, we'd been very pushed. He was a brilliant man. Who could visualize something as beautifully shaped as this? It didn't look as if it was meant to be a fighting machine, did it? It just looked as if it was a beautiful thing to fly, which it was. And yet it could be a lethal weapon.
Mitchell's pretty little toy was about to teach the German pilots a new game. In May 1940, the Germans invaded France. Within a month, France had fallen. Britain now stood alone. Churchill told the nation, "The Battle of Britain is about to begin."
By July 1940, Britain's position seemed really bleak. It had always been assumed that German bombers would have to fly all the way from their bases in Germany to Britain, and the distance was too great for fighters to accompany them. Now some bombers were based scarcely more than 20 miles from the shores of Great Britain, and fighters could accompany them all the way to their targets.
The battle began with dive-bombing attacks on shipping in the English Channel as Germany prepared for an invasion of England. All that stood between survival and defeat was a narrow strip of sea and the young pilots of Fighter Command, like 19-year-old Dave Glauser.
As far as I was concerned, we were there to stop it. If there was an invasion, we'd have a damn good go at the enemy.
Soon, Britain's chain of coastal radar stations came under attack. Then, it was the turn of the fighter airfields. Without proper training, pilots like Bam Bamberger relied on their aircraft and on their own courage.
I think really survival at that stage depended more on luck than anything else.
Bob Doe certainly needed all the luck he could get.
No one told us anything before we went into action. In fact, I'd only ever fired my guns once. We were given, I think, 20 rounds per gun. We were told to go and shoot them to the North Sea. Well, you can't miss the North Sea, really. We got our Spitfires in March, and we flew them every day until we were shoved into the Battle of Britain. That summer produced the best summer I think we'd had for ages. During that short period, I only remember one day when we couldn't fly.
Good flying weather meant daily visits by the Luftwaffe. Losses began to cause serious concern. By mid-July, they were running at a level that would see the elimination of the RAF in 6 weeks. As they waited for the order to scramble, the pilots knew just how slim their chances of survival were.
Waiting for the scramble was much worse, in my opinion, than flying in combat. I was very tense, probably apprehensive of what I was going to come up against. It was all an unknown quantity. Okay, you tried to read. Mostly, I think you tried to sleep or doze, but it was waiting.
We used to play cards, or painting, drawing. A lot of them did sleeping.
And then suddenly, the telephone would ring. And you'd be all alert. And it was someone saying the nappy was coming around with tea.
The RAF was outnumbered roughly 2-1. To even the score, it was vital to use its limited resources effectively. The key to this was radar. This pioneering form of electronic warfare was primitive, but it worked. With a skilled operator, the range, bearing, altitude, and scale of an attack could be predicted, giving the defending fighters a head start. The radar stations reported to Fighter Command's headquarters at Bentley Priory, northwest of London. From here, the order to engage the enemy would pass through the sector controllers to the individual fighter squadrons.
562, EP78.
Suddenly, the chain reaction would begin. A blip on the radar screen. A telephone call to headquarters.
We have 40+ bandits at Angels 1-5, Vector 1-8.
A rapid assessment of the situation. A decision on which squadron should intercept the enemy. A final phone call. And the barked order, squadron, scramble.
It was almost with relief when the scramble came.
The phone would ring, and we'd leap up from whatever we were doing and start running towards our aeroplanes.
You were so preoccupied that at that point you hadn't time to feel apprehensive or scared.
Everything now depended on speed. The squadron had to get airborne in a matter of minutes and gain height as quickly as possible to engage the enemy on equal terms. The greatest fear in the mind of every pilot was of being caught on the ground, the helpless victim of a surprise attack. Now, the young pilots of Mitchell's Spitfires would have to fight for their lives.
Fighter pilot. The words convey something of the spirit that lies in our squadrons. Something young and vigorous, decisive, wanting action at once and finding its expression in the struggle going on daily over our southeastern shores. But you have not yet been let into the mind of the men who do the flying, nor shown their feelings when in the air and going into a fight.
I was very frightened. I suppose it was natural to be frightened.
And we did everything wrong we could possibly do wrong. We flew off in close formation, which is the most stupid thing you can do. It means the only person not formating is the leader, so there's only one person looking around.
The leader looks round to see if the rest of his section are with him. One is lagging a bit and is told briskly on the radio telephone to close up.
I was probably not concentrating so much on flying a good formation. I was looking for those enemy fighters.
And then they climb up to patrol height.
We got up the same height that we were told the enemy were, which again is fairly stupid, you want to be above them. We proceed to patrol up and down sun, which is idiotic, because half the time you can't see a blind thing behind you.
the majority of pilots who were shot down during the Battle of Britain were shot down from behind and taken by surprise. So that's why you developed a rubber neck. You could turn your head through 360 degrees.
Suddenly the leader sights something. Tally ho! There they are, Jerry's.
First time I saw 100+ German aircraft, I knew we were going to attack it. I thought, well, this must really be it.
We just found ourselves in the middle of hundreds of aircraft. And that's when the battle started.
You had to keep a jolly good watch out for the right position to bring the boys round and then in. The natural instinct for these bombers in close formation was to break, with this spit coming down.
When you're flying an airplane, you're moving as well as the target. So you have to compute in your head how far in front of that airplane you've got to fire, because when you fire these bullets, it takes a little time for it to reach, shall we say, 300 yards. And in that time, an airplane can move a long way.
The slower-moving bombers presented fairly easy targets, but any attack on them would instantly provoke retribution from above, as their fighter escorts swept into the attack.
The important thing is to see the other person before they see you. If you see him first, you've got a damn good chance of shooting him down or alternatively avoiding him. But if you don't see him, that's when you're in real trouble.
And suddenly, these 109s flashed past with their yellow noses. They looked killers, and they looked professional, and I felt very much an amateur. I saw a tracer going past my aircraft, and someone in the squadron shouted, "Break," which I did. And suddenly, I found myself alone in the sky, and there was no one else there, not even any enemy aircraft.
I found myself behind a 110, so I closed up on it and shot at it. And I was utterly astonished when this thing turned over and dived down into the sea. I then followed him down. I saw him crash into the sea, and as I pulled up, I realized I was being shot at from behind, and this aircraft overshot me. So I settled behind him and shot him down. So I was shot 2 down in my first operation, without knowing what was happening in the sky around me or who was doing what.
Everyone was looking after themselves or trying to achieve something. And so it was individuals taking flash shots at other individuals.
But for many young pilots, their first mission was also their last.
In my case, I was sheer luck that I wasn't killed in my first action. It wasn't any skill on my part.
My aircraft was not hit, and I didn't fire my guns, but I came back to base slightly wiser.
Until you've learned, you haven't a hope of living, unless you're very, very lucky, as I was.
Each aircraft had its own ground crew. Their job was to prepare it as quickly as possible for the next scramble. All 8 machine guns had to be checked and reloaded by the armourers. Each gun was fed by a belt of 300 rounds of ammunition, 2,400 rounds in total, giving the pilot roughly 15 seconds worth of firepower. Meanwhile, the fuel tanks were refilled. The oxygen supply was replaced, and any engine problems reported by the pilot were investigated. The pilot and his crewmen knew that his life depended on their skills, and a close bond often grew up between them.
The ground crew had their own airplane, which they looked after, and I think they took more interest in what had happened than anyone did. And they're questioning you all the time, they're getting you out of the plane, and they're very enthusiastic, they're a wonderful lot.
They were in it just as much as we were, there's no doubt about it. They had a hell of a job to do.
Despite the bitterness of the struggle, the fighter pilots of both sides often displayed a strong sense of chivalry in combat.
I couldn't bring myself to shoot at him anymore. And so I flew up alongside him about 20 yards away. I could see this tall, blonde, big bloke just sitting there looking at me. So I just put my hand up and turned away and left him. I knew he'd have to go down to the sea. And in fact, it turned out I should have shot him down because he was picked up by his own side and taken back, and he came out and shot more of our people down. So I should have shot him down, but I just couldn't bring myself to do it.
The 109 started to smoke very early on, and I stopped firing, partly to save ammunition. And partly, I suppose, in a sort of not really wanting to kill somebody. So I flew up alongside, slid my cockpit canopy back, and could see him struggling with this 109 to try and rescue the airplane and himself. Unfortunately, about 500 feet, he lost control. I went straight in and burst into flames.
I never once considered I was shooting at a person. They were just aircraft I was shooting at. It never entered my head of a pilot being in it.
Soon, wrecked aircraft littered the English countryside. This was an entirely new kind of warfare, fought in full view of the civilian population, but far above their heads. In the gardens and the harvest fields of southern England, the people gazed up at the drama unfolding above them.
Already in the First World War, fighter pilots had become popular heroes. And now in 1940, the fighter pilots of Fighter Command, with their casual clothing and their devil-may-care attitude, became gladiators, acting out this drama in the skies over southeast England, with the population like an audience looking up at them.
The mission of the Luftwaffe pilots was to destroy the RAF and its bases at all cost. But on September the 7th, 1940, there was a sudden and dramatic change of plan. Hitler ordered a massive bombing campaign against London. The Blitz had begun. For Londoners, it was the beginning of a nightmare. But for the hard-pressed RAF, it meant a reprieve. As the Luftwaffe switched to bombing London, the Battle of Britain entered a new and far more bitter phase. This was no longer a gladiatorial contest. This was the slaughter of innocent civilians. But while Londoners paid the price, the RAF was given the breathing space it so desperately needed to rebuild its strength and avenge the victims.
There's absolutely no doubt that the German change of emphasis from bombing radar stations and attacking the RAF to bombing London was a major mistake. Events later in the war were going to show that neither the German bombing of England nor the Allied bombing of Germany, which was much, much heavier, would actually break civilian morale. So by taking the pressure off the RAF, the Germans actually made the decisive mistake in the Battle of Britain.
As productivity improved, replacement Spitfires began coming off the production lines faster than the Germans could shoot them down. They left the factory as anonymous and identical machines. But once in the hands of a pilot, each one began to acquire an identity and a personality.
You became acquainted with your own aircraft, and your own aircraft had a particular smell, a particular feel.
From the time I got my first airplane in the Squadron, I always tried to fly D for dough. And whilst you can't fly it on every occasion, because it does have to be repaired or serviced on occasions, any other time, any other airplane never felt quite right. Whereas D for dough did, it was mine.
My favourite aircraft had G on it. And if G wasn't serviceable for some reason, I was very bad-tempered.
The one when I bailed out and this thing went into the sea, I was flying another chap's aeroplane because mine was in for maintenance. And he was furious.
Both the Spitfire and the Hurricane took a surprising amount of punishment, quite happily. I mean, on one occasion I had bullets straight through my main spar on a Spitfire. But it flew back quite happily, no problem. And I think almost every time I went into action, I got hit. I never knew where from. On one occasion I had 12 bullets in the thing. I was very lucky that none of them hit me, of course.
It made you think, this is a dangerous business I'm in.
Dennis Robinson was hit, like most pilots, from behind by a German fighter he never even saw.
And the only thing I could think to do, and I did it actually spontaneously, was just push the control column hard forward. And the poor old Spitfire practically stood on its nose. I was absolutely amazed. Down I went, absolutely vertical. I managed to pull out in time in a steep climbing turn, hoping to see my adversary in full power. And in the middle of that, the engine stopped dead on me. Fortunately, there wasn't another aircraft in the sky. It often happens in battle, you suddenly find yourself all alone. I did a pretty good touchdown with the wheels up. And I was feeling pretty pleased with myself, and all of a sudden, the cockpit was filled with dust and dirt, and then I could feel the Spitfire lifting up again, and I thought I was crashing over on my back. I don't really know what happened, except the left wing was torn right off. As soon as the action stopped, of course, I immediately threw the canopy back and realized then that the Spitfire finished up vertically in a ditch and I could easily jump clear.
But even a Spitfire as badly damaged as this one could help to keep others in the air. Reusable wings, engines and tails were simply grafted onto new or repaired fuselages to produce more fighters. But although their aircraft could be patched up, the exhausted pilots could not.
The overriding memory that I have of the Battle of Britain period is a terrible tiredness. We were on duty from half an hour before first light until half an hour after dusk. I know that if I sat down and went to sleep during that period, I don't know whether it's lack of sleep or nerves. I think it's probably a combination of the two. Your nerves are working like mad.
The most flights that I did involved in Joint Battle of Britain was five scrambles in one day. And at the end of a day like that, you are both physically and mentally stressed out. You know, you'd had it.
I think it was difficult to deal with because you had to deal with your own anxiety about what was going to happen, which way it would happen to you. I think we settled for the fact that there wasn't much chance of surviving it, really.
Among the pilots, there was a mood of grim determination to finish the job. But no one knew how much longer they could hold out. As the Battle of Britain reached its climax, the raids on London became more intense. Large areas of the city were destroyed as huge fires raged out of control. The turning point came on September the 15th, 1940. As the first reports began streaming in from the coastal radar stations, the empty map at Fighter Command headquarters began to fill with mounting evidence that this day's raid would be the biggest yet. As 500 German raiders headed for London, they were intercepted by more than 300 Spitfires and Hurricanes. As Londoners watched, the huge spectacle unfolded over the city. The sky was full of dogfighting aircraft as the German formations broke up and scattered. At the end of the day, the RAF proudly claimed 185 kills, later revised down to 60. But it was enough. 2 days later, Hitler abandoned his invasion plans, and the Battle of Britain was over.
We did very well over the Battle of Britain, there's no doubting that at all. But God was on our side because, as was said at the Battle of Waterloo, it was a very, very close-run thing.
The Germans hadn't won air superiority, and without it they had no chance of invading across the Channel. And they hadn't hurt Britain so badly that the British government or the British population wanted to sue for peace. Britain was still there, still in the war, an unsinkable aircraft carrier for Allied bombing attacks on Germany, and that springboard from which the Allies would eventually mount the invasion of Europe. It was all down to the Battle of Britain, and there was a great tribute to the fighter which had helped make it all possible. The German air ace Adolf Galland was asked by Goering what he really wanted to win the battle. He replied, Spitfires.
The Spitfire was steadily improved in stages throughout 6 long years of war. Production of the aircraft the ministry once proposed to cancel eventually reached more than 22,000.
I think if Mitchell could have lived and seen this beautiful machine do all the things it did, I think he would have been very proud, as he should have been too.
I've flown Defiance, I've flown Lysanders, I've flown jet aircraft, I've even flown helicopters. And the only aircraft I really loved was the Spitfire.
The Spitfire captured the public imagination as no other aircraft has before or since. It became a symbol of freedom and helped to save Britain and civilization from what Winston Churchill called the new dark age of Nazi tyranny. His final verdict on the young RAF airmen who fought the Battle of Britain has become part of the nation's folklore. Never in the field of human conflict has so much been owed by so many to so few.